Israel. Thank you very much. For more, I want to bring in Ravi Agrawal. He is the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy and host of FP Live. Kim Ghattas is also with us. She is a contributing writer for The Atlantic and a distinguished fellow for Columbia University's New Institute of Global Politics. And Hala Gorani is here. She's an author, a veteran journalist who has covered the Middle East and so many important events. Hala, I want to start with you because I want to talk about the scope of this, as I was just talking about with Raf. NBC News' chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, said this morning that a Hamas attack on this scale has never been contemplated. And I think, as Raf talks about the failure of imagination, that is a really important point. You know, the question so many people are asking right now is, how did this happen undetected?
Yes, that's the question everyone is asking. How did it happen undetected? How was Hamas able to mount this multi-pronged attack from the air, from the land, and from the sea? You have to remember, Gaza, the Gaza Strip is under a strict blockade and has been for many years. So as far as ordinary Israelis are concerned, the Gaza Strip is contained. You may have a few cross-border attacks or a few rocket attacks on a much smaller scale, but an incursion that leads to essentially an occupation of Israeli territory by Palestinian fighters and gunmen. This is something that I don't think anybody imagined. If the Israeli government suffers from a failure of imagination, I would have to put myself in that group as well. I did not imagine that Hamas fighters, militants would be able to cross the border and achieve this and then take some of these Israeli civilians and soldiers back across the border into Gaza. And what Raf was saying, which is also remarkable, is that there is still a fight going on for some of the territory that these Hamas fighters were able to control in one police station. But we're talking here about the mighty Israeli army against this group that managed this really remarkable and bewildering incursion into Israeli territory. So yes, a massive failure of intelligence, a failure of imagination. And what's even more remarkable is that some 10, 12 hours later, the fight is still going on. And we know now that there are kidnap victims inside of Gaza, civilians, reports of children, women, and soldiers as well, which will very much complicate the task of those in the Netanyahu government who are trying to figure out how to respond, Symone.
You know, Kim, Hamas controls the Gaza Strip, and we have had a map that has been in the corner here, and we're going to put it up on the screen for you shortly. But what has Hamas said about this particular attack on Israel? I will note, and the map is up on your screen right now, I will note the red line to the left of the red line, that is the Gaza Strip. To the right is Israel. And there are a number of places that you can see on this map where all the red dots are in Israel where attacks have taken place.
Well, Symone, thanks for having me. Speaking to you from Beirut, where, of course, there's also some concern about whether this could escalate into a multi-front confrontation. And people here wondering whether Lebanon will be dragged into this as well, with Hezbollah across the border here in Lebanon issuing messages of support as well, saying that they're in direct contact with the Palestinian militant leadership, saying that this is an attack that shows that is against the Israeli or continued Israeli occupation, but also a message to those who are trying to normalize with Israel, i.e. Saudi Arabia. The Palestinian leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, has issued more or less the same statement today, saying that this shows that Israel cannot protect Arab countries. What he means is normalizing with Israel is not going to protect you as Saudi Arabia or other countries. So I see this as, in a way, a regional confrontation via Hamas. And if Hamas was able to pull this off, it's really only because of the support of Israel. This took months of planning, highly coordinated training, intense training for these men who went into Israel. I suspect even I would like to venture into saying that perhaps they got training outside of the Gaza Strip, somehow managed to come back in, but they got support from outside for sure. These attacks are very reminiscent of the way that Hezbollah carried out operations against Israelis who were occupying South Lebanon for a few decades until the year 2000. And of course, Iran. Celebrations in some quarters in Iran, in the Iranian parliament, we saw members of parliament chanting death to Israel. Make no mistake, this is about Hamas, the Palestinians and Israel, but this is also, I think, a decision taken on a more regional level in the Iran axis that includes Hamas, Hezbollah, but also Syria. And we heard from another Palestinian leader as well saying, this will help stop Israeli attacks on Iranian and Hezbollah assets in Syria.
Ravi, I want to bring you into the conversation here and follow up on a point that Kim is making, the regional aspect of this. And again, we only know what we know at this point in time, which is why the questions about intelligence are so critical. And I think it's why we've seen very measured statements, if you will, from everyone from the U.S. president, President Biden, to other presidents within the region. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said that the enemy will pay a price it has never known before. There has been criticism of how the prime minister responded initially. There was a lag in time. What are folks saying on the ground, Ravi, about how his response is being received and just the regional aspect of this?
Sure. I mean, just on Netanyahu, I mean, this is a prime minister who's been embattled. He's had serious corruption allegations against him. There have been significant protests going on in Israel week after week after week all year that are some of the most significant in that country's history. Amid all of that, it's worth noting that whenever there is a crisis like this, Israelis tend to rally around the government of the day. And we've already seen Israeli opposition leaders come out and say they stand by the IDF, they stand by everything that needs to be done now. So I think that's where it stands from the Israeli point of view. But, you know, when you zoom out a little bit more regionally, I completely agree with Hala and Kim on how this is a failure of imagination. It is a failure of intelligence. Remember, Israel just has immense resources at its hand to make sure that something like this doesn't happen, not least of all the Iron Dome, which usually has a success rate of about 90%. But it is also a failure of diplomacy, and that is a bigger regional issue at play here. You'll remember that over the last few weeks, the United States has been trying to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Clearly, some part of these attacks have something to do with that. And there are echoes, not just across the region, but in history when you go back to the Yom Kippur War. It's very clear that Hamas's objectives here, which were clearly being planned for months, which clearly had regional support, as Kim has pointed out, it all dovetails into a status quo in the region that was tenuous at best. And anyone who thought that one could be complacent about this has had that illusion shattered today.
You know, a number of people have made this point about the regional aspect as it relates to Saudi Arabia and the normalization of relations and formalizing diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Hala, I'm just wondering, can you just talk about why those conversations were so significant and what this current attack, this conflict that we are seeing now, how that could impact those conversations?
Well, those conversations were significant because of the fact that these countries, namely Saudi Arabia, other Gulf countries, seem to be ready for reasons that were not necessarily political, but that were practical, that were based in the desire to increase business relationships between the country. Were ready to go ahead and accept that normalization with Saudi Arabia was something that was not just something they could consider, but something that they could engage in earnest. What was left off the table during these negotiations were the Palestinians. The Palestinians practically didn't even figure on the strategic map of these talks. It was about normalizing relations with Arab countries that didn't necessarily have a stake in what happened to the Palestinians and didn't really consider that to be a strategic motive. what this attack today achieved was to remind the world and the actors in the negotiations, these normalization talks, that the Palestinians are a factor. And this is something that cannot be ignored any longer. This is what I find interesting in terms of how this may impact normalization talks going forward, is the Palestinian question must once again be placed at the heart of some of these talks, and not just the diplomatic, practical, logistical, business relationships that could be established between Israel and Arab countries that it normalizes relationships or relations with as a result of these Abraham Accords. So I think that's also very significant, Symone.
Hala, Gorani, thank you. Kim, Ghattas, thank you both very much. Ravi, Agrawal, you're going to stick around because we have some additional things to discuss later.